The guest register at Gossington Hall had been signed. That was the peculiarity. Colonel Bantry kept no guest register, had never kept one in 40 years of hosting shooting parties, dinner dances, and the occasional overnight visitor. There was no such book in the house. And yet there it was on the mahogany side table in the entrance hall, a slim leather-bound volume, burgundy, with the name Arthur Donovan written in a careful, unhurried hand on the first and only page. The date beside it was Tuesday. The Colonel had been in London since Monday. No one in the household could account for the book or for the man. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where the English countryside keeps its secrets poorly and its silences rather too well. Tonight we return to Gossington Hall, where a name in a register nobody owns may prove more dangerous than the body no one expected to find. This is The Uninvited Guest at Gossington Hall. Chapter 1. The Register. The morning had begun, as most mornings in St. Mary Mead tended to begin, with very little of apparent consequence. A thin October mist lay across the village green, softening the edges of the post office and the like gate of St. Christopher's into something faintly impressionistic, as though the village itself had not yet fully decided to exist. Mrs. Bantry's gardener, Hatch, was cutting back the last of the dahlias along the Gossington Hall drive. The kitchen cat had stationed herself on the coal-house step with the self-possessed authority of a magistrate. Somewhere beyond the kitchen garden, wood-pigeons were conducting a low, repetitive conversation about nothing in particular. Miss Jane Marple, walking that Tuesday morning with the modest purposefulness of a woman who has found that walking after breakfast keeps the joints more obliging than resting ever does, paused at the top of the lane to adjust her glove. From there, through the gap in the hornbeam hedge, she had a clear view of the hall's front elevation. She was not, she would later insist, watching for anything. She had simply paused to adjust her glove. What she observed from that slight elevation was Mrs. Bantry standing in the open doorway of her own home with the posture of a woman who has found something inside it that she did not put there. Dolly Bantry was not, as a general rule, a woman given to stillness. She moved through her house, her garden, her village, with the cheerful velocity of someone perpetually 10 minutes behind where she intended to be. To see her standing motionless in a doorway, one hand on the frame, the other pressed flat against her breastbone, was sufficiently unusual to register. Miss Marple did not quicken her pace. She continued along the lane at the same measured rate, turned through the hall gates, proceeded up the gravel drive past Hatch and his dahlias, and arrived at the front step in what she considered a perfectly natural fashion. "Dolly," she said. "Good morning. Is everything quite all right?" Mrs. Bantry turned. Her expression, Miss Marple noted, was not the expression of a woman who has found a mouse in the larder or a damp patch in the ceiling plaster. It was something rather more complicated than that. It contained surprise, certainly, but underneath the surprise, arranged like furniture beneath a dust sheet, there was the distinct shape of something that might, with time, become fear. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, though Hatch was nowhere near. "Come and look at this." The entrance hall of Gossington Hall was a comfortable, unpretentious space, flagstone floor, watercolours of the Dorset coast, a barometer that had not been accurate since 1931, and a mahogany side table on which the morning's post was customarily arranged. Today, alongside 2 circulars and what appeared to be a bill from the farriers, there sat a slim volume bound in burgundy leather. It was the size of a small hymnal. It was quite new. Neither its binding nor its pages showed any sign of age or use. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. She did not open it at once. She turned it over, examined the spine, felt the quality of the leather, good quality, she noted, though not exceptional, and then opened the front cover. One entry. Written in a black ink hand that was neat without being educated, deliberate, regular, the letters formed with patient, almost mechanical care. Arthur Donovan. Guest, 14th October. That was all. Arthur Donovan, Mrs. Bantry repeated, as though the name might clarify itself upon repetition. I don't know anyone called Arthur Donovan. Robert doesn't know anyone called Arthur Donovan. I've asked every member of the staff, and not one of them has ever heard the name. When was this found? Miss Marple asked. This morning. Mary was dusting the hall at 7:30. She says it was not there last night when she locked up at 10. Miss Marple set the book back on the table with the same careful movements with which she had lifted it. She looked at it for a moment in the way one looks at a crossword clue that seems at first to be straightforward. And the Colonel is still in London? He rang last night. He's not back until Thursday. Has anyone been in the house? A tradesman? A visitor? Anyone who might have left it by mistake? Mrs. Bantry looked at her steadily. Jane, it is a guest register. In a house that has never had a guest register, with one name in it. A name nobody recognizes. Left overnight, in a locked house. She paused. People do not leave guest registers in other people's hallways by mistake. Miss Marple agreed that they did not. There is another matter, Mrs. Bantry said, after a silence of perhaps 5 seconds. Her voice was very even now, which, in Miss Marple's long experience of Dolly Bantry, was not a reassuring sign. The east garden gate was unlatched this morning. It is always latched. Hatch is particular about it. Miss Marple looked once more at the little burgundy book on the table. Someone had entered Gossington Hall, signed a register that did not exist, and left before morning. The curious thing, the detail that stayed with her as Mrs. Bantry went to ring for tea, was that the ink was fully dry. Whoever had written that name had not done so in haste. They had waited for it to dry. That suggested, rather strongly, that they intended to come back. Chapter 2. The man no one remembered. The tea arrived at 9:10, brought by Mary with the punctual reliability of someone who considers hot beverages a form of moral support. She set the tray on the low table beside the drawing-room fire. For Mrs. Bantry had decided, without quite articulating why, that she did not wish to remain in the entrance hall, and then hovered at the door with the particular expression of household staff who have information they consider it their professional duty not to volunteer. Miss Marple noticed the expression. She had spent a great many years noticing expressions that hovered in doorways. Mary, she said pleasantly, did you hear anything unusual last night, after you locked up? Mary's hand tightened on the door frame by a fraction. No, miss. A pause. That is, I'm not certain it was anything. There are foxes along the east wall this time of year. They make a considerable noise. What time? Miss Marple asked. Another pause. Longer this time. 11:30, perhaps. Perhaps a little after. Mrs. Bantry set down her cup. You didn't mention this earlier. I thought it was foxes, Mary said, with the slightly defiant composure of someone who has persuaded themselves of something and resents having the persuasion undone. I still think it likely was. Of course, said Miss Marple warmly, quite sensible. Though I wonder, did it sound as though it came from the East Garden specifically, or further along? Mary considered this with visible reluctance. The East Garden, she said at last. Near the gate, I should think. She paused once more, then added, with the air of someone making a concession they will regret, there was a light. Very brief, like a torch being switched on and off. I told myself it was the Hargreaves boy cutting through again. He does, sometimes on his way back from the village. But it was rather late for him. After Mary had gone, the two women sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows the departure of a witness. So, Mrs. Bantry said, someone came through the east gate, entered the house, placed a guest register containing one name on the hall table, and left, in the middle of the night. It appears so, Miss Marple agreed. But why? What possible reason? That, said Miss Marple, lifting her cup, is the more interesting question, isn't it? Not who, not yet. Why a register? Why that table? Why leave evidence of having been here at all? She paused. One does not announce an uninvited visit unless the announcement itself is the purpose. Mrs. Bantry looked at her. You think it was a warning? Miss Marple did not directly answer. She turned the teacup slightly in its saucer. I think it was a communication, she said carefully. Whether it is a warning depends entirely on whether Arthur Donovan is the man who entered or the man who was meant to find the entry. This distinction, which had not previously occurred to Mrs. Bantry, settled over the room with the particular weight of an idea that cannot be undone once introduced. She sat with it for a moment, then reached across and pulled the bell rope again with rather more force than the situation strictly required. By 10:30, Miss Marple had taken her leave and was walking the long way back through the village, which is to say the way that passes the post office, the greengrocer, and the bench outside the Bells and Motley, where retired men of the village gathered on dry mornings with the dedicated purposelessness of the genuinely contented. On the bench this morning sat two such figures. Mr. Hodgson, who had worked the Gossington Hall estate as a carpenter for 23 years before his retirement, and beside him, Mr. Albert Trice, who had been the village postman from 1934 until his knees declined to continue the arrangement. Miss Marple paused. She commented on the mist. She observed that October had been unusually mild. She inquired after Mr. Trice's sister in Cheltenham, and then, in the same seamlessly conversational register, she asked whether either of them had ever heard of a man named Arthur Donovan. The name produced a result she had not anticipated. Not blankness, not the polite, searching pause of people consulting an honest memory. Instead, something rather more specific, a flicker of recognition in Mr. Hodgson's face, quickly rearranged, and a stillness in Mr. Trice that was a fraction too deliberate to be natural. "Can't say I have," said Mr. Trice. "No," said Mr. Hodgson. "Name doesn't ring a bell." Both statements were, Miss Marple felt quite certain, untrue. She thanked them pleasantly and walked on. She did not look back. There was no need to. She had registered what she needed, not what they had said, but the exact interval between hearing the name and saying they did not know it. Honest unfamiliarity is instantaneous. What she had seen was the interval of a decision. Arthur Donovan was not unknown in St. Mary Mead. He was merely someone people had agreed, or been persuaded not to speak of. At 11:15, she stopped at the post office on the pretext of a book of stamps, and while Mrs. Swettenham served her with the stamps and the local knowledge she dispensed in equal measure, Miss Marple mentioned, in passing, that she had heard the name Arthur Donovan mentioned in connection with Gossington Hall. The effect was subtler this time, but no less legible. Mrs. Swetnam's hands continued their movements over the stamp book without interruption, but her eyes performed a rapid, involuntary calculation, and when she spoke, it was on an entirely different subject. That, in Miss Marple's long experience, was its own form of answer. Arthur Donovan had been here before, or he had been expected, or both, and in a village this size, the difference between a secret and a forgotten thing was simply the number of people who had agreed to forget it. She walked home through the mist, and the wood-pigeons continued their conversation, and somewhere behind her, in the entrance hall of Gossington Hall, the little burgundy book sat on the mahogany table with its one careful entry. Waiting, it seemed, for something. Or someone. Chapter 3. What the Gardener Knew. The afternoon light in October arrives with a certain apologetic quality, as though aware it cannot stay long and wishes to cause as little disruption as possible by its departure. By 2 o'clock it had thinned to a pale watery gold that lay across the kitchen garden of Gossington Hall in long flat strips, illuminating the turned earth of the vegetable beds and the last of the runner bean frames with the same impartial documentary clarity. Miss Marple had returned to Gossington Hall at 1:30, nominally to return a preserving pan she had borrowed from Mrs. Bantry in August, and had been meaning to bring back ever since. It was, she considered, a perfectly adequate reason for a second visit. The preserving pan was real. The timing was deliberate. She found Hatch at the far end of the kitchen garden, doing the kind of slow, methodical work that gardeners of long experience make look contemplative rather than laborious. He was turning compost into the far bed with the steady rhythm of a man who has learned that the garden rewards consistency above all other virtues. He did not look up when she approached along the flagstone path, though she was quite certain he had heard her. Hatch had spent 40 years listening to this garden. He heard everything in it. "Good afternoon, Hatch," she said. "Miss Marple." He continued turning, mild for the time of year. "Very mild," she agreed. She stood for a moment, observing the bed, noting the quality of the dark, heavy soil with the appreciative eye of a fellow gardener. "You've done well with this corner. I remember it being very poor when the Bantrys first took the hall." This was true, and Hatch knew she knew it was true, which established them, without further ceremony, on the footing of two people who are not going to waste each other's time. "The East Gate," Miss Marple said, in the same tone she had used about the soil. Mrs. Bantry mentioned it was unlatched this morning. Hatch set down his fork with a deliberateness that was not quite a pause, but was not entirely unrelated to one. It was, "Do you latch it yourself, in the evenings?" "Every evening. 7 o'clock, regular." He picked up the fork again. "Have done for 30 years. Then someone unlatched it from the inside, I imagine," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Or from the outside with a key." A beat. The fork turned once. "There are only 3 keys to that gate," Hatch said. "The Colonel's, Mrs. Bantry's, and the spare, which is kept on the hook in the potting shed." Miss Marple turned and regarded the potting shed at the far corner of the kitchen garden. It was a solid brick structure, older than the hall's current configuration, with a wooden door that stood at present slightly ajar. "Is the spare there now?" she asked. Another pause, rather longer. "It is," Hatch said. "I checked this morning." "Ah," said Miss Marple. The syllable carried, as her syllables often did, a quantity of meaning disproportionate to its size. Hatch heard it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Someone could have borrowed it and replaced it," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Someone who knew where it was kept. She allowed this to settle. Someone familiar with the property. Hatch turned 2 more forkfuls of compost in silence. A robin arrived on the fence post beside him with the cheerful opportunism of its kind, eyeing the disturbed soil with professional interest. "There was a man," Hatch said at last, in the tone of someone conceding a point they have spent some time deciding whether to concede. 2, perhaps 3 weeks ago. Came to the gate on the East Lane side. Asked whether there was work going. Casual labour, he said. Garden clearance. What did he look like? Miss Marple asked. Medium height. 40, perhaps 45. Dark hair going grey at the sides. Wore a brown coat, good quality but old. Spoke quietly. Hatch considered. Too quietly, if you take my meaning. The way a man speaks quietly when he's chosen to, not because it's natural to him. Did you take his name? Told him we weren't needing anyone. He went away. Another pause, and then, with the reluctance of a man adding a detail he would prefer not to have noticed, he didn't come to the front gate. He came to the east gate specifically. Asked for it by name, said he'd been told to inquire at the east gate. The robin abandoned the fence post. Miss Marple watched it go. Told by whom, did he say? No. And I didn't ask. Hatch met her eyes for the first time since the conversation had begun. His gaze was level, the gaze of an honest man who is aware he has not until now been entirely forthcoming, and who has decided that the time for not being forthcoming is over. I should have mentioned it when Mrs. Bantry was asking this morning, I know that. I didn't mention it because, he stopped. Because you recognize the description, Miss Marple said gently. The fork went still. The kitchen garden held its quiet. The mist had retreated to the hedgerows, and the thin gold light lay patiently across the turned earth. And somewhere in the hall behind them, in the entrance hall on the mahogany table, the little register waited with its one name. Not the man himself, Hatch said carefully. But the description. He set the fork against the compost heap with the finality of a full stop. There was a man who used to come to the hall. Years ago, before my time here, but not so far before that people didn't still talk about it. He paused once more. His name wasn't Donovan, but the description is close enough to give a man pause. He would not, Miss Marple sensed, say more than that today. But he had said enough. There was a history here, threaded beneath the surface of Gossington Hall like the old drainage channels beneath its lawns. Invisible, structural, and still apparently capable of carrying water. She thanked him for his time, retrieved the preserving pan from the kitchen, and walked home in the late apologetic afternoon light. Behind her, the east gate stood latched, as it always was, as it had always been. Except for once. Perhaps more than once. Chapter 4. The Colonel's Letters. Colonel Bantry returned from London on Wednesday evening, a day earlier than anticipated, which Mrs. Bantry later said she ought to have expected, because Robert always returned early from London in October. The city, he maintained, became unreasonable in October. The traffic, the clubs, the conversations at the clubs, all of it acquired in October a faint but unmistakable quality of excess that a man of his temperament found wearing after 2 days. He arrived at 6:30, handed his coat to Mary with the absent-minded courtesy of a man who has performed the gesture 10,000 times, accepted the whisky his wife pressed upon him with rather more attentiveness, and then stood in the entrance hall and looked at the small burgundy book on the mahogany table for a period of approximately 15 seconds, without speaking. Mrs. Bantry, who had been watching his face with the careful lateral attention of a woman married to a particular man for 31 years, said, "You recognize it." It was not a question. The Colonel picked up the book. He opened it. He read the single entry with the expression of a man reading something he had spent a considerable time hoping he would not have to read. Then he closed it, set it back on the table with a precision that suggested he was controlling the force of the gesture, and said, "Where did this come from?" "We don't know," Mrs. Bantry said. "That is the difficulty." Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall at 10 o'clock Thursday morning to find the Colonel in the library, which in the Bantry household served the dual function of book repository and serious conversation room. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the lawn with the posture of a military man confronting terrain he would prefer to withdraw from, but understands he cannot. He turned when she entered. "Miss Marple." He gestured at the chair by the fire with the automatic hospitality of his kind. "Dolly said you'd been helpful, asking about." "She said," he paused, "she said you'd want to know the truth of it." "Only if you wish to tell it," Miss Marple said, settling herself into the chair, "though I confess I have formed the impression that the name Arthur Donovan is not entirely unknown in the neighbourhood, and that whatever history attaches to it has been kept rather carefully quiet." Colonel Bantry looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the desk, opened the lower left drawer, the one with the small brass lock Miss Marple noted, the drawer a man uses for things he does not wish to be casually found, and removed a bundle of letters bound with household string. He set them on the desk but did not immediately hand them over. His hand rested on them briefly, as though performing a small private ceremony of relinquishment. These came, he said, over the course of approximately 4 months, beginning last March. They were addressed to me personally, marked private. "The handwriting," he paused. "You'll see the handwriting." Miss Marple took the bundle and untied the string. There were 7 letters in total. The envelopes were plain, white, purchased from any post office counter in England. The postmarks varied, twice from Exeter, once from Bristol, once from a small market town in Shropshire whose name she did not immediately recognise, and 3 times with postmarks too faint to read clearly. Each letter was written in the same hand she had seen in the register. Neat, deliberate, patient. She read the first letter carefully. Then the second. They were not threatening. That was the first and most significant observation. A threatening letter announces itself immediately, in its rhythms, its word selection, the particular energy of someone who wishes to produce fear. These letters contained none of that energy. They were, if anything, almost formal, almost quiet. The first introduced the writer as a man who had, he said, some years previous, been connected with Gossington Hall in a capacity he did not specify. He wished the Colonel to know that he was alive. He wished the Colonel to understand that he bore no ill feeling. He asked in language of scrupulous politeness whether a meeting might be arranged at the Colonel's convenience. The subsequent letters, arriving at irregular intervals of 2 to 5 weeks, repeated these themes with the patient persistence of someone who has decided to wait for a response without abandoning the expectation of one. The tone never escalated. The requests were consistent, acknowledgement and a meeting. The Colonel had not responded to any of them. Miss Marple set the letters down on her knee in a neat pile and looked into the fire for a moment. "He says he was connected with the Hall," she said. "In what capacity?" "He doesn't say. But you know." The Colonel returned to the window. The lawn was silver with overnight frost that had not yet fully yielded to the morning, and the copper beech at the far end stood in the thin sunlight with the dark solemnity of something that has survived a great many seasons. "There was a man," he said, 22 years ago. He worked here briefly, 3 months, perhaps 4. There was an incident. Nothing criminal, nothing that went to the police. But he left. He was asked to leave." He stopped. "And the name he worked under?" Miss Marple asked. A pause of considerable length. Outside, a wood pigeon landed on the copper beech, and the branch dipped fractionally beneath its weight. "Not Donovan," the Colonel said. "He called himself then by another name entirely." He turned from the window. His expression was the expression of a man who has reached the boundary of what he can say comfortably, and is standing at it, looking across. The question is why he has changed it, and why, after 22 years of silence, he has decided to come back. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "The more pressing question," she said gently, "is whether the man who signed that register and the man who wrote these letters are in fact the same person." The Colonel stared at her. "They may not be," she said simply, "and if they are not, then someone else entirely is using that name, which raises a rather different set of questions." The frost on the lawn continued its slow, quiet retreat. Chapter 5. The Woman in the East Wing. There was a room in the east wing of Gossington Hall that was not, technically speaking, in regular use. This was not unusual in houses of that size and age. Such houses accumulate rooms the way certain families accumulate obligations, gradually, without particular intention, until one day it becomes apparent that there are more of them than can be comfortably managed. The room in question was on the first floor, at the end of the east corridor, and had been used at various points in the hall's history as a sewing room, a night nursery, and, during the war, temporary storage for evacuated furniture from a house in Exeter that had subsequently not survived the Blitz. It was currently described by the household as a box room. Miss Marple learned about it not from Mrs. Bantry, and not from the Colonel, but from a conversation she had not been intended to overhear. She had been shown to the small sitting room adjacent to the library to wait while Mrs. Bantry finished a telephone call, and the wall between the 2 rooms was, as walls in houses of that period frequently are, considerably less substantial than it appeared. The conversation she heard was not Mrs. Bantry's telephone call. It was an exchange between 2 voices in the corridor directly outside the sitting-room door, conducted in the low, urgent register of people who believed themselves unobserved. The first voice was Mary's. The second, Miss Marple established after a moment, belonged to the younger housemaid, a girl called Penelope who had joined the Bantry household in June, and who Miss Marple had spoken to only once, briefly, at the summer fete. "She asked again this morning," Penelope said. Her voice was tight with the specific anxiety of someone navigating a situation whose boundaries they do not fully understand. "She asks every morning," Mary replied. "You say the same thing every morning. The room is being aired. That's all you say. But she can see the window from the garden. She knows someone's been in there." A short silence. "Mary," Penelope said, and her voice dropped further, taking on the quality of someone about to say something they have been resisting. "Who is she?" "Mrs. Bantry acts as though she's always been here, but she hasn't. She wasn't here in the summer. I would have known." "That," said Mary, with the finality of a woman closing a subject rather than answering it, "is not something either of us needs to concern ourselves with. We do our work. We keep our counsel. That is all." Footsteps retreated along the corridor in both directions. Miss Marple sat quite still in the small sitting-room and looked at the arrangement of dried flowers on the mantelpiece with the expression of someone who has just been handed an unexpected piece of a puzzle and is determining where it fits. There was a woman in the East Wing. Mrs. Bantry arrived 12 minutes later with the slightly distracted energy of someone whose telephone call had not gone entirely as planned, and accepted without apparent suspicion Miss Marple's inquiry about the East Corridor rooms, which Miss Marple framed as a question about whether the hall suffered from the damp that afflicted so many older properties at this time of year. The response was informative precisely because of what it omitted. Mrs. Bantry spoke about the ground floor, the library, the kitchen passage, and the cellars. She did not mention the East Wing at all. "The first-floor corridor," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I remember it being particularly cold when I visited in February. That window at the far end never quite fitted its frame properly, did it?" Mrs. Bantry's response was a fraction too smooth. "We've had it seen to," she said. "Much better now." Miss Marple smiled and accepted a biscuit and said nothing further on the subject. She raised it instead with the Colonel that afternoon when Mrs. Bantry had gone to the village on errands. The Colonel was in the library again, standing before the letters she had returned to him, as though their physical presence in the drawer was insufficient containment, and he needed occasionally to verify they had not escaped. "There is someone staying in the East Wing," Miss Marple said, not accusingly, merely as a statement of observed fact, in the manner of someone noting that a particular rose has come back more strongly than expected. The Colonel was quiet for what she counted as 11 seconds. "My wife's cousin," he said. "She arrived some weeks ago. She is not well. She prefers quiet." "I see," said Miss Marple. "What is her name?" Another pause. Shorter this time. Elena Voss. And she has been here since the middle of September." He turned from the window. "Miss Marple, Elena is a private woman in difficult circumstances. I would ask that whatever enquiries you are making, they remain at some distance from her." Miss Marple regarded him with the mild, clear attention she gave to things that interested her. "Of course," she said. "Though I wonder, has Mrs. Bantry mentioned the register to her? Or the letters?" "No, absolutely not." "I see," Miss Marple said again. And then, after a moment, with perfect gentleness, "And yet Penelope mentioned this morning that Mrs. Voss had been asking questions. About the room, about who had been in it." She paused. "Which suggests she already knows something has happened. Or that she has been expecting something to happen." The Colonel set down the paperweight he had not been aware he was holding. Outside, the copper beech stood in the afternoon light, darkly patient. The East Wing window, the one that had been seen from the garden, caught the pale sun briefly and released it. Somewhere on the first floor, in a room described as a box room, a woman named Elena Voss sat in the particular silence of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has recently begun to suspect that the waiting is nearly over. Chapter 6. Elena. The East Wing corridor smelled of beeswax polish and something older beneath it. The particular dry, papery scent of rooms that have been closed for long periods and recently reopened, as though the air inside them has grown accustomed to stillness and resents the intrusion. Of circulation. Miss Marple noticed it the moment Mrs. Bantry opened the door at the corridor's entrance on Friday morning, having finally, after a silence of considerable length at the breakfast table, agreed that an introduction might be arranged. "She knows you're coming," Mrs. Bantry said, in the tone of a woman who has negotiated something difficult and is not entirely certain the negotiation has held. She agreed. Which, it isn't always easy. Eleanor doesn't always agree. "I shall be very brief," Miss Marple said. "And very ordinary." Mrs. Bantry looked at her with the expression of someone who has known Miss Marple long enough to find this particular assurance only partially reassuring. The room at the end of the corridor was larger than the designation of box room had suggested. Someone, recently, from the smell of fresh paint at the skirting, had made genuine efforts toward comfort. There was a good chair by the window, a writing table, a narrow bookshelf containing a mixture of volumes that had been chosen with apparent care rather than assembled from surplus. A small electric fire burned in the grate with the dedicated orange cheerfulness of its kind. In the chair by the window sat Eleanor Voss. She was, Miss Marple estimated, somewhere between 50 and 55, though the particular quality of stillness she possessed made precise estimation difficult. It was the stillness of someone who has learned to occupy as little of a room as possible, and it had the effect of making her seem both younger and older than she was, depending on which aspect of her one observed. Her hair was dark, with grey threaded through it, worn plainly. Her hands, folded in her lap, were the hands of someone who had once done physical work of some kind. Her eyes, when she looked up, were grey and direct, and gave the impression of someone conducting their own assessment with rather more efficiency than she was permitting to be visible. "Miss Marple," she said. Her voice was level, with the faint, careful modulation of someone who has trained themselves out of a regional accent without quite completing the process. Mrs. Voss. Miss Marple settled into the chair that had been placed, she noted, at a considerate but not intimate distance, close enough for easy conversation, far enough to permit withdrawal. Someone had thought about that distance. She was not certain it had been Mrs. Bantry. "I hope I'm not disturbing you unduly." "You're not," Eleanor said. "You're investigating. It's quite different from disturbing." Mrs. Bantry, hovering at the threshold, made a small sound. I'll be downstairs," she said, and retreated with the relieved decisiveness of someone excusing themselves from a conversation they had not been certain how to conduct. The door closed. Eleanor Voss looked out of the window at the east garden. The frost had returned overnight, and the lawn held it in the shadowed areas beneath the wall, white and precise as chalk marks. The gate was visible from this angle, the east gate, latched now, ordinary in the morning light. "You watch the gate," Miss Marple observed. "I have been watching it," Eleanor said, "since the 3rd week of September, since you arrived. Since I arrived." A pause. "Or since I was brought here, depending on how one characterizes it." The Colonel was kind enough to suggest it. Dolly was kind enough to agree. They believed I would be safer here than where I was. "And where were you?" Eleanor turned from the window and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that contained, in carefully modulated measure, assessment, resignation, and a very faint shadow of something that might have been relief. "Bristol," she said. "Before that, Exeter. Before that, a number of other places." She paused. "I have been moving for approximately 14 months. The word moving carried in it, Miss Marple felt, a great deal more than its primary meaning. It carried the weight of packing at short notice, of memorizing bus timetables, of learning which landladies asked questions and which did not. "Because of Arthur Donovan," Miss Marple said. The name in the room produced a silence that was different in quality from the silences that had preceded it. Those had been the silences of people deciding what to say. This was the silence of someone for whom a name has physical weight. "That is what he calls himself now," Eleanor said at last. "He has used other names, several." She looked down at her folded hands. "He is my husband. That is, he was my husband. The marriage was dissolved, or I attempted to dissolve it. He has not, in his own understanding, accepted that dissolution." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Outside, a blackbird landed on the frost-stiffened grass of the east garden and moved across it with quick, precise steps. "The Colonel knew him," Miss Marple said, 22 years ago, here at the Hall." "Yes." Eleanor's voice remained level. "That is how I met him. Originally. I was employed here briefly, as a seasonal cook. He presented himself as something he was not. That was, I came to understand, habitual." She paused. "He is not a violent man. I want to be precise about that. He has never been violent. He is persistent, patient. He believes that if he waits long enough and appears in enough doorways and leaves sufficient evidence of his presence, I will eventually agree that leaving was a mistake." She looked at the gate again. "The register," she said quietly, "was not for the Colonel. It was for me. He knew I would hear of it. He wanted me to know he had found me. The frost held in the shadows. He had found her." Chapter 7. The Other Name. Miss Marple walked home from Gossington Hall that Friday afternoon by the longest available route, which took her past the church, along the footpath behind the allotments, and through the small copse of silver birch that separated the older part of the village from the newer. She walked slowly, which was not entirely a consequence of her age. She walked slowly because she was thinking, and she had long ago established that her thoughts arranged themselves more usefully when her feet were in motion beneath them. Eleanor Voss had said, "He has used other names. Several." That was the thread she pulled at now, turning it carefully, the way one turns a loose thread in good fabric, with sufficient force to understand it, but not so much as to damage the surrounding weave. A man who uses several names is not necessarily a man engaged in anything criminal. There were ordinary, mundane reasons for such habits: a difficult past, a fresh start, the simple human desire to become, in a new place, someone slightly different from who one had been in the old. Miss Marple was not disposed to assign automatic villainy to the practice. She had known respectable people who had changed their names, and she had known people with perfectly consistent names who were thoroughly villainous. The name was not the point. The point was the pattern. 7 letters over 4 months. 14 months of following. The deliberate placement of the register, not hidden, not threatening, simply placed, like a calling card left by someone who understands that the act of leaving it will be understood. That was a particular kind of persistence. Controlled. Intelligent. Patient in a way that most people in Miss Marple's experience found more unsettling than open aggression because it offered nothing to push against. She stopped at the church on the way back, not from any immediate religious impulse, but because St. Christopher's kept its parish records in the vestry, and the current vicar, Mr. Clement's successor, a pleasant if slightly harried young man named Fothergill, had on previous occasions demonstrated a cooperative attitude toward historical inquiries framed as genealogical interest. He was in the vestry when she arrived, engaged in the quarterly struggle with the boiler that afflicted every stone church in England between October and March. He greeted her with the slightly distracted warmth of a man grateful for any interruption that does not require him to make a decision about the boiler. "The parish registers," Miss Marple said, after the appropriate preliminary courtesies. "I wonder, I have become interested in the history of some of the families connected with Gossington Hall, the working households specifically. Would the records extend to staff in any period?" "They did not," Mr. Fothergill explained. "As a general rule, parish records documented baptisms, marriages and deaths, not employment, but the churchyard itself was comprehensive, and the hall had historically maintained strong connections with the parish. Several families who had worked the estate across generations were buried in the south-east corner." Miss Marple expressed appropriate interest in the southeast corner. She spent 40 minutes there in the thin autumn sunshine, reading stones with the patient, unhurried attention of someone for whom the dead are neither morbid nor remote, but simply a further category of evidence. Most of what she read was unremarkable. The ordinary accumulation of village life across 2 centuries. The repetition of family names that spoke of deep roots and limited mobility. But in the 3rd row from the east wall she found what she had come, without quite articulating it to herself, to look for. A modest stone, grey limestone, recently cleaned, within the last year or 2 she estimated, from the condition of the surface. The inscription read, "George Roper, 1891-1951. Faithful service." Below it, added later, the lettering a different hand, the stone slightly different in colour where the new cutting met the old, and in memory of his son Thomas Roper, 1922. Whereabouts unknown. Miss Marple stood before this stone for rather longer than she had stood before the others. Whereabouts unknown was not standard memorial language. It was not language of grief or celebration or religious comfort. It was the language of a file left open, of a family that had not received closure because closure had not been possible. Thomas Roper. Born 1922, son of a man who had given faithful service to an estate. Whereabouts unknown. She returned to Mr. Fothergill and asked, with the gentle, persistent curiosity that people tended to experience as conversational rather than interrogative, whether he knew anything of the Roper family. He did not, personally. He had only been in the parish 4 years, but he recalled that his predecessor had mentioned, in the context of some discussion about the churchyard maintenance fund, that there had been some question about the Roper stone. A woman had come, some years back, to arrange the additional inscription. She had paid for the cleaning. She had not given her name. "Can you describe her?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Fothergill considered. "Dark hair, middle-aged perhaps, quiet. My predecessor said she seemed," he used the word burdened, "as though she were discharging an obligation she found painful." Miss Marple thanked him warmly and walked the remaining distance home in the early dusk, the village settling around her into its evening arrangements of drawn curtains and lamplit windows. Thomas Roper. Whereabouts unknown. She was becoming increasingly certain that Thomas Roper's whereabouts were not, in fact, unknown. That he had been at various times in Exeter, in Bristol, in a number of other places, that he had stood at the east gate of Gossington Hall 3 weeks ago in a brown coat, speaking quietly, and that Arthur Donovan was not the first name he had used, nor the second, nor perhaps even the third. The question was not who he was. The question was what had happened 22 years ago in this house that had set all of it in motion. Chapter 8. What happened in November? The letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on Saturday morning, which was surprising, and had been pushed beneath the front door rather than delivered through the letterbox, which was more surprising still. It was on plain white paper, folded once, and contained 11 words in the now familiar hand. I mean no harm to anyone in that house. T.R. Miss Marple read it twice, set it on the kitchen table beside her tea, and looked at it with the expression she reserved for things that were simultaneously clarifying and complicating. Then she put on her coat, tucked the letter into her bag, and went to see Mrs. Bantry. She did not, on this occasion, go to Gossington Hall. She went instead to the village tea-room, where she had, by a brief telephone call made before leaving the cottage, arranged to meet Mrs. Bantry at 9:30. There were reasons for this choice of location that she did not fully articulate, even to herself, beyond a general sense that the hall had too many rooms containing too many people who were, in various ways and for various reasons, listening. Mrs. Bantry arrived 4 minutes late, with the expression of a woman who has left her house under some internal pressure and is not entirely certain she has handled the departure correctly. She sat down, accepted tea, and looked at the letter Miss Marple placed before her without touching it, as though physical contact might constitute a commitment she was not prepared to make. "Beneath your door," she said. "Before 7 this morning, I think. The paper was cold when I found it at 7:15. Mrs. Bantry was quiet for a moment. Around them the tea-room conducted its ordinary Saturday morning business. Farmers discussing drainage, the solicitor's wife reading a letter of her own, 2 girls from the village school sharing a bun with the democratic precision of the very young. "Robert told me last night," Mrs. Bantry said, "about the other name. Thomas Roper." She curled both hands around her teacup. "He told me everything, Jane. Or he told me what he knows. I am not entirely certain it is everything." "What did he tell you?" Mrs. Bantry looked out of the tea-room window at the village green, where the October mist was performing its usual morning business of slow, indifferent retreat. "In November of 1931, she said, Thomas Roper was 19 years old and employed at Gossington Hall as an undergardener. His father, George, had worked the estate for decades. Thomas was. Robert says he was a clever boy, too clever, perhaps, in the way that sometimes causes difficulty when circumstance doesn't accommodate the cleverness." She paused. Miss Marple said nothing, which was frequently the most productive contribution available. There was a young woman, Mrs. Bantry continued, a housemaid. Her name was Clara Fenn. Robert says she was very pretty and very young, and not perhaps as aware as she ought to have been of the complications that attended certain kinds of attention from certain kinds of young men. She stopped again. Clara Fenn became pregnant. In the autumn of 1931. The tea-room continued its ordinary business. Miss Marple lifted her teacup. Thomas Roper was dismissed, Mrs. Bantry said. The Colonel's father managed it quietly, which was the way such things were managed then. Clara was given money and sent to a relation in Derbyshire. The child, Robert doesn't know what became of the child. He was a boy at the time, only 12, and he learned the story in fragments over the following years, the way one learns uncomfortable household histories. She paused. Clara died in 1940. A bombing in Sheffield. Robert found that out some years later, through the family solicitor. Miss Marple set down her cup with the careful precision of someone filing information into its proper place. "And Thomas Roper," she said. "What became of him in 1931? "He left. He was given a reference for garden work, a thin courtesy, Robert says, that his father arranged because George Roper had been loyal for 20 years and deserved that much consideration for his son. Thomas went to Bristol initially, Robert believes. After that, nothing. George Roper never spoke of him publicly. The stone in the churchyard was, I think, George's private acknowledgement that he had lost his son as surely as if he had buried him. Miss Marple considered the window. A sparrow landed on the outside sill, assessed the situation, and departed. The child, Miss Marple said. Clara's child. A boy, you said. Robert believes so. He is not certain. Born approximately early 1932, one would estimate. Yes. Mrs. Bantry looked at her. Jane. What are you? Eleanor Voss, Miss Marple said quietly. She told me she met Thomas Roper, met the man she would marry, when she was briefly employed at Gossington Hall as a seasonal cook. She did not give a date. She paused. I find myself wondering what year that was, and whether Eleanor came to the Hall knowing its connection to Thomas, or whether she learned of it afterwards. Mrs. Bantry stared. You think she knew him before? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Eleanor Voss knows a great deal more about Thomas Roper's history than she disclosed to me yesterday. Which is entirely her right. People share what they are prepared to share. She refolded the letter. But the stone in the churchyard was cleaned and the additional inscription added by a dark-haired, middle-aged woman who did not give her name. And Eleanor Voss has dark hair and would have been middle-aged at the relevant time. Mrs. Bantry was silent for a long moment. She was discharging an obligation, Miss Marple said gently. That was the word used, burdened, as though discharging an obligation she found painful. She placed the letter in her bag. The question is whether that obligation was to Thomas Roper himself or to someone connected to him. Outside the mist had retreated entirely, and the village green lay in pale autumn sunlight, ordinary and quiet, holding its history beneath its surface the way old ground always does. Patient. Undisturbed, waiting to be read. Chapter 9. The Silent Observer. There was a boy in St. Mary Mead whom almost nobody noticed, which was, Miss Marple had long considered, precisely the kind of detail that rewarded noticing. His name was Daniel Priest. He was 17, the son of the woman who ran the laundry on Vicarage Lane, and he possessed the particular quality of invisibility that attaches itself to quiet, observant young people in small communities. The invisibility not of absence, but of consistent, unthreatening presence. He delivered laundry twice weekly to Gossington Hall. He cycled the lanes at hours that other people were indoors. He sat, on dry afternoons, on the low wall behind the post office with a paperback novel that he held open without, so far as Miss Marple had observed across several years of peripheral attention, ever appearing to turn a page. He was, in short, someone who watched. And in Miss Marple's considerable experience, people who watched were frequently in possession of information that people who talked had entirely missed. She found him on Saturday afternoon on his customary wall, the paperback open at what appeared to be page 47, the same page she noted it had been open at 10 days ago. Daniel, she said pleasantly, I wonder if you might help me with something. He looked up, without surprise. People who observed habitually were rarely surprised. "If I can," he said. Miss Marple settled herself on the wall beside him with the practised ease of a woman who has long since ceased to concern herself with the opinions of passers by regarding where she chose to sit. "You deliver to Gossington Hall on Tuesdays and Fridays," she said. "The east entrance, I believe, the tradesman's gate on the lane side." Daniel was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone deciding whether to cooperate, Miss Marple felt, but the quiet of someone selecting the correct starting point. "The east gate, yes," he said. "Mrs. Pierce takes the laundry at the kitchen door." "Have you noticed anyone in the East Lane recently?" "Someone unfamiliar to the neighbourhood." The paperback closed. It closed with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone setting aside one form of attention in order to give another form its proper space. "There was a man," Daniel said. "I saw him 3 times. Once on a Tuesday, 3 weeks ago. Once the following Friday. And once last Wednesday evening. Late. I was cycling back from Treadwell's farm. Can you describe him? Medium height. Duck coat, not brown, navy, I think, in the evening light. He wasn't walking particularly. He was standing. Both times in the day he was on the lane side of the east wall, looking at the gate, not trying to open it, just regarding it." He paused. "The 3rd time, Wednesday evening, he was inside the garden." Miss Marple was still. "Inside, yes. I saw him through the gap in the hornbeam hedge, the same gap you can see from the top of the lane. He was standing in the east garden near the copper beech. He wasn't moving. He was looking up at the 1st floor window." Another pause. The light was on in the window. The east wing window. "It went off while I was watching." Miss Marple thought of Eleanor Voss in her chair, watching the gate. Eleanor watching for him. And Thomas, if Thomas it was, watching back, from the shadow of the copper beech, in the cold Wednesday dark. "You didn't mention this to anyone," she said. "It was not a criticism, it was an observation." "I didn't know who to mention it to," Daniel said, with the honest simplicity of someone who has thought about a question and arrived at a true answer. "I didn't know if it was something. People stand in gardens." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Though usually in their own." She considered. "Daniel, on the Tuesday morning, the first time you saw him, did you notice anything else? Anything about his manner, or anything he was carrying?" Daniel's eyes moved briefly to the middle distance with the characteristic movement of someone accessing a specific memory rather than constructing a general impression. "He had a bag," he said. "A small leather bag, like a document case. He was holding it carefully, not swinging it. The way you hold something you don't want to damage." He paused. "And he was reading something. A piece of paper. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket when he saw me." A piece of paper. A letter, perhaps, or an address, or something else entirely. A document case held carefully against the body in the October chill. "Did he speak to you?" Miss Marple asked. He nodded. The way people nod when they want you to understand that they've seen you and are not concerned by you, without committing to a conversation. A brief pause. He had a calm face. That was what I noticed most. Most people who are standing in lanes looking at other people's gates look furtive or anxious. He looked calm, as though he had every right to be there and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to exercise it. The patience again. The controlled, unhurried patience of a man who has waited 14 months and is prepared to wait further. "There is one more thing," Daniel said. He said it in the tone of someone who has saved a specific detail not from reluctance, but from an instinct for correct sequencing. On the Wednesday evening, when I saw him in the garden, before the light went off in the window, before he looked up at it, he took something from the document case and placed it at the base of the copper beech. He put a stone on top of it so it wouldn't lift in the wind. Miss Marple looked at him. "I cycled past the hall this morning," Daniel said. "Early, before anyone was about. Whatever he left is gone. Someone has collected it." The pale October sun moved behind a cloud. The village held its Saturday afternoon quiet around them, unhurried, ordinary, concealing in its familiar surface the deep and complicated channels of what had happened and what was still apparently happening. Someone had collected it. The question was whether that someone had been Eleanor Voss or someone else entirely moving through Gossington Hall's east garden in the early morning with purposes that had not yet fully declared themselves. Chapter 10. The Document Case. Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead carried its own particular quality of suspended time. The church bell marked the hours with the unhurried authority of something that has been marking them for centuries and expects to continue indefinitely. The village arranged itself around the morning service with the comfortable predictability of long habit, the same families in the same pews, the same draught from the north transept door, the same 3 members of the choir whose enthusiasm consistently outpaced their accuracy. Miss Marple attended the service as she always did, and listened to Mr. Fothergill's sermon on the subject of patience, which she found, given the week's preoccupations, rather aptly chosen, though she was quite certain the coincidence was unintentional, and afterwards stood in the churchyard in the thin Sunday sunlight, exchanging the customary pleasantries with her neighbours. She was, simultaneously, thinking about the document case. A man who carries a leather document case carefully, in the manner of someone protecting its contents, and who places something from it at the base of a tree weighted against the wind, has communicated in a particular way. He has not posted a letter. He has not knocked at a door. He has chosen a method of delivery that is simultaneously private and deliberate. A method that requires knowledge of the garden, knowledge of the window, and a reasonable confidence that the intended recipient would understand where to look. That confidence implied prior communication, not the 7 formal letters delivered through the post to the Colonel, which had the quality of official correspondence, almost legal in their careful language. Something else. Something more personal, suggesting a channel of communication that had been established separately, quietly, beneath the surface of the observable situation. Eleanor Voss, Miss Marple reflected, had told her that she had been moving for 14 months. Bristol, Exeter, other places unnamed. The Colonel had brought her to Gossington Hall in mid-September because he believed she would be safer here. But Thomas Roper had found her here within weeks of her arrival. Either he had followed her from the previous location, possible, consistent with the pattern of persistent tracking she had described, or someone had told him where she was. Miss Marple turned this second possibility in her mind with the careful attention it deserved, because it was the possibility that opened the larger and more troubling question. Eleanor was known to 3 people at Gossington Hall: the Colonel, Mrs. Bantry, and the household staff. The household staff consisted of Mrs., Pierce the cook, Mary the senior housemaid, and Penelope the junior housemaid, who had joined in June and who had asked Mary, in the corridor outside the sitting room, a question whose phrasing had stayed with Miss Marple. "Who is she?" "Mrs. Bantry acts as though she's always been here, but she hasn't." That was the question of someone genuinely puzzled. But puzzlement and communication were not mutually exclusive. She arrived at Gossington Hall at 2:00, and asked, with the pleasant directness that she had found across a lifetime produced better results than elaborate misdirection, to speak with Penelope. The girl was brought to the small sitting room with the expression of someone who has been anticipating a conversation and has not been comforted by the anticipation. She was perhaps 20, with a round, honest face that was not at present arranging itself into the composed neutrality of someone with nothing to conceal. She sat in the chair indicated and folded her hands in her lap, in the careful way of people who have been told that fidgeting creates an unfavourable impression. Penelope, Miss Marple began, in the tone she used for conversations that required the other party to feel safe rather than interrogated. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am not looking for anyone to be in trouble. I am looking for clarity. Those are quite different things." Penelope's hands tightened fractionally. "Yes, miss. You have been at the Hall since June. In that time, have you been in contact with anyone outside the household who asked you about Mrs. Voss? Her presence here, her movements, her routine?" The silence that followed was of a specific and informative texture. It was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone calculating the cost of saying it. "There was a letter," Penelope said at last. Her voice was very quiet. "It came in August, before Mrs. Voss arrived even. Addressed to me personally, at the Hall. I don't know how I hadn't given this address to anyone except my mother." "What did it say?" It asked whether anyone had come to stay, or was expected to stay. A woman, it said, middle-aged. It said she was a relation of the writer, and that there had been a family difficulty, and he only wished to know that she was well. She paused. It seemed a kind letter. Worried, not threatening. It was signed A. Donovan. Miss Marple regarded her gently. "And you replied?" "Only once." Penelope's voice carried the particular anguish of someone who has understood, too late, the consequence of a single decision. Only that yes, a lady had come to stay in September, and she seemed quiet but well. That was all I said. I didn't know who Mrs. Voss was, or why she was here, or—" She stopped. "Of course," Miss Marple said. "You had been asked a simple question by someone who presented himself as a concerned relation. You answered it simply." She paused. "Did you keep his letter?" Penelope shook her head. "I burned it. It seemed the right thing afterwards, when I started to wonder. The right thing, done too late, Miss Marple thought, was one of the most common features of human difficulty. People rarely acted wrongly from malice. They acted wrongly from the gap between available information and required judgment, a gap that widened always precisely at the moments that mattered most. The document case, she said, almost to herself. Penelope looked up. "Miss?" But Miss Marple was already considering the next question, which was not who had told Thomas Roper that Eleanor was here, that was now answered, but what had been in the case, and what Eleanor had done with whatever she had collected from the base of the copper beech in the early morning dark, and whether, in collecting it, Eleanor Voss had made a decision that would change what happened next. Chapter 11. The Gathering at Gossington. Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall at 10 o'clock Monday morning with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has, over the course of a weekend, assembled a sufficient number of pieces to understand the shape of the whole. Not every detail. Not every confirmation, but enough. Enough to know that the situation had reached the particular point at which further delay served nobody well, and might, if allowed to continue, serve certain parties very badly indeed. She had telephoned the Colonel at 8 o'clock. She had asked him to ensure that Mrs. Bantry, Eleanor Voss, and the household staff were all present at the hall at 10. She had asked this in the tone she occasionally employed that made requests sound like the most natural arrangement in the world, which was, in her experience, considerably more effective than making them sound like requests. The Colonel had agreed without asking why, which suggested he had spent his Sunday arriving at conclusions of his own and was prepared for a reckoning. They assembled in the library, which was large enough to accommodate the gathering without discomfort, and carried, in its arrangement of worn leather chairs and heavy curtains and walls of quietly authoritative books, something of the atmosphere of a room in which serious things had been said before and could be said again. The Colonel stood at the mantelpiece. Mrs. Bantry sat in the chair nearest the fire, with the composed expression of a woman who has decided that whatever is about to happen, she will face it without flinching. Eleanor Voss had come downstairs for the first time since her arrival, and sat in the high-back chair nearest the door. Not, Miss Marple noted, the door to the hall, but the window, which looked out across the east garden. Mary and Penelope stood near the bookshelf. Penelope's face was pale and determined in the manner of someone who has made a private resolution. Mrs. Pierce had stationed herself beside the door with the immovable quality of good kitchen furniture. Miss Marple took the chair in the centre of the room, which nobody had offered her, and which she had selected herself, and folded her hands in her lap. "I am going to tell you what I believe happened," she said pleasantly, "and I should be grateful if anyone who finds themselves in possession of contrary information would say so. I have no interest in constructing a neat account at the expense of an accurate one." Nobody spoke. Thomas Roper, she began, was dismissed from this house in November of 1931, at the age of 19, following circumstances that were managed quietly and at considerable human cost to several parties. He left carrying two things: a legitimate grievance and an illegitimate secret. The secret was that Clara Fenn was expecting his child. She paused. The fire settled. Eleanor Voss looked at the window. Clara went to Derbyshire. The child, a boy, was born in the spring of 1932. Clara died in 1940. What happened to the boy in the intervening years and after is something I do not know in full detail, but I believe Thomas Roper spent a considerable portion of his adult life attempting to find out, and I believe that at some point, perhaps many years later, perhaps relatively recently, he did find out, or found out enough. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, with the composure of someone who has rehearsed a truth for a long time and found that the moment of its telling is simultaneously harder and easier than anticipated, she said, "The boy was adopted, a family, in Shropshire. His name was changed. He grew up not knowing anything of his parentage." She paused. "Thomas found him 12 years ago. He did not approach him directly. He simply watched, as he watches everything, from a distance through various means." Another pause, smaller. "The boy, the man, died in 1962. A road accident. He was 30 years old. He left a daughter. The library was very still." "The document case," Miss Marple said gently. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her cardigan and placed on the small table beside her chair a folded envelope. It was plain white, unsealed. "He left this at the Copper Beech. Daniel, the laundry boy, I had seen him watching on the Tuesday. I trusted him to notice and not interfere. I collected the envelope myself before dawn on Thursday. What does it contain? The Colonel asked. Documents, Eleanor said. Legal documents. Copies, very careful copies, properly certified. She looked at her hands. Thomas has been, in his own way and by his own strange methods, attempting to write something. The child, Clara's grandchild, the daughter, is now 11 years old. She is in a children's home in Shropshire. Thomas has spent 3 years attempting to establish, through legal channels, that she has a traceable family lineage, that she is not, as the records suggest, without people. She paused. He needs the Colonel's confirmation of the 1931 circumstances. A witnessed statement. He cannot compel it. He is asking for it. The silence in the library was of a different quality now. It had lost its tension and acquired something more complex in its place, the particular weight of a situation revealing itself to be other than it had appeared. Colonel Bantry looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. Why didn't he simply write and ask me directly? Because, Eleanor said, with the weariness of someone who has spent years translating a particular man to an uncomprehending world, he was afraid you would refuse without explanation. He wanted you to understand, first, that he was not a threat, that he had not come back in anger. She paused. The register was not a warning, and not a threat. It was an introduction. He was announcing himself as a guest, requesting, in his peculiar fashion, to be received. Miss Marple looked at the Colonel. The Colonel looked at the envelope. Outside, beyond the east garden wall, the copper beech stood in the pale Monday light, patient and dark and still, its branches holding the cold air with the steadiness of something that has stood through many seasons of human complication and expects to stand through many more. I will write the statement, the Colonel said quietly, whatever is needed. Penelope exhaled. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Bantry looked at the fire with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite sorrow, but contained, in its careful stillness, something of both. Miss Marple unfolded her hands and rose from the centre chair. The thing that had been set in motion in November of 1931, through an act of thoughtlessness and institutional convenience, and the particular cruelty of problems solved by disappearance rather than resolution, had not, it turned out, resolved itself into crime or violence or any of the darker outcomes that its surface had suggested. It had resolved itself into a child in a children's home in Shropshire, who did not yet know that somewhere a man with several names and a document case held carefully against the cold had spent 3 years ensuring that she would not remain without people. Miss Marple walked home through the October village in the mild, forgiving light, and the wood pigeons conducted their low conversation in the hornbeam hedges, and St. Christopher's bell marked the half-hour with its customary, unhurried certainty, and St. Mary Mead arranged itself, as it always did, into the appearance of a place where very little of consequence occurred. She knew better, of course. She always had.